All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I am the president of Network 2020. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, Network 2020, we're a nonprofit organization. We're an inclusive international community, and we're really trying to highlight and drive innovative solutions to critical challenges in the foreign affairs space. So we work through educational programs like these, briefings. We also run research programs abroad. We have some impact programs that derive from our research programs. So we do a number of things. Please check out our website, follow us on social media, follow us on YouTube, and you can learn more about our work. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Aaron Salzberg and to welcome back Scott Moore to Network 2020. So for introductions, first we have Scott, and he is the Director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives at UPenn. And he is a political scientist whose interests center on the environmental sustainability, technology, and international relations. And critical to this conversation, he is the author of Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building in Shared River Basins. We are also very pleased to welcome Aaron Salzberg. He is the director of the Water Institute at the University of North Carolina. He was also the US State Department's first special coordinator for water, where he led the development and implementation of US foreign policy on drinking water and sanitation, water resources management, and transboundary water and conflict. And he has decades of experience looking at water in the international space. So welcome to both of you. It is a real pleasure to speak to you both about this critical issue really coming, especially on the heels of COP27. So with that, Aaron, welcome. I'd like to start with you. In your talk at Water at Wilson, Raging Waters, you mentioned lack of access to sustainable water supplies for large numbers of people and the long-term implications of that lack of access on economic development and conflict, as well as some of the key challenges that exacerbate the global water situation. So what, in your mind, just so we're all on the same page, are the central challenges that we see regarding water stress today, and how severe is that threat?
Well, hi, Courtney, and thank you for the kind introduction, and to the Network 2020 for inviting me to join Scott and do this. It's really a lot of fun, I hope, and an honor. It's actually pretty simple, right? Nothing is more important to human health, human security, economic growth, and the environment and water. We all need it. And so really, in the most simplest sense, when demand exceeds supplies, then we have a problem. And that's what concerns a lot of folks. And that's really the first challenge, right? How do we ensure that our water use is consistent with renewable and available supplies of water? And there are a lot of places around the world where that's a real challenge. Where right now we're using more water than is available. That's going to lead to real sustainability challenges in the future. I think the other key challenge that you might think about is reducing pollution and pollution, right? Certainly we talk about microbial contamination and the impact on human health, but chemical contamination, metal contamination is really increasing. Agriculture, industrial activity are really taking our water supplies out of use. In other words, the water is becoming too polluted for us to be able to use it for the purposes that we want to use it for. And so then that water is no longer available. And so that reduces, again, this supply and demand balance that we have to worry about. And then maybe the third challenge is around climate change. We know climate's going to impact the distribution, timing, intensity of precipitation events. We see this more and more where we're getting 3, 10, 12 inches of rain in a day or in a few hours. And that can really have a huge impact on infrastructure and people and livelihoods. We're also seeing longer periods of drought. Don't want to blame all this on climate change, but there's no question this increased variability is going to really challenge countries and communities that don't have the infrastructure in place to capture the water when it comes and be able to keep that water and make it available for when we need it. And for example, the American West is a key example, right? As temperatures go up, our snowpack goes down, and that snowpack is really our reservoir of water for the spring for the farmers. If instead it's raining in the wintertime and that water is running down the mountains when we're not growing crops, that presents a real problem. And so I'd argue that those three, reconciling supply and demand, pollution, climate change, are really the biggest challenges. That said, when it comes to water, probably the biggest challenges that we face are not related to water. It's about access to data and information. It's about building the technical capacity that we need to provide the services that we're talking about. It's about financing. And probably most of all, it's about governance. If we don't have the right government commitment to addressing these issues and the right government institutions in place, these are going to be really, really hard problems to tackle.
Thank you. You just gave us a lot to think about, and I hope some of this emerges in the Q&A at the end. Scott, turning to you, in your article, How to Solve the Global Water Crisis, you mentioned that the real challenges with water crises, to Aaron's point earlier, are political, and that the foreign policy implications flow from the destabilization of local and national politics. So can you please elaborate on the role of foreign policy in shaping water politics and the role of, especially what Aaron mentioned earlier, governance, and how you see that playing a role?
Thanks so much, Courtney, for having us for this conversation. I should admit up front, if I actually knew how to solve the global water crisis, I'm sure I'd have a Nobel Prize right now, or at least be on somebody's private jet somewhere. But sadly, don't have all the answers. So what I would say, building on what Aaron mentioned, and it is tough to follow Aaron. He covered a lot of the important points already. But one of the aspects of water that does make it difficult, or more difficult than some other kind of global environmental challenges, to even more difficult, I should say, to tackle, is the fact that it is very regionally distinct in terms of what water resources obviously look like in a given region, and also what the governance structures look like for water resources in different areas. And there are lots of layers to that. Countries have wildly different policies related to things like water rights. But then obviously, once you get to the international level, it's the case that virtually every major river basin in the world is an international transboundary one that spans national borders. The same is true for many large aquifers. And so you have all of the familiar challenges to international cooperation and coordination that exist with water resources. So it's sort of a combination, I would say, of fragmented governance that's very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And then you've just got the international governance layer on top of it. And one other aspect, I think, of water that's always struck me as kind of significant in kind of contrast to energy, for example, is that there's nothing close to a global market for water, whereas there is for many energy commodities. Oil, coal, for the most part, we do have some type of international market for those commodities. Water, and we can certainly get into the extent to which water is or is not a commodity, but the fact is that there's no global market for it. And so I think once you get into kind of the political economy of water, or the use of economic tools to deal with water resource challenges, that's a real difference from other areas.
Really interesting point. Thank you. Aaron, so your role at the State Department, I think that this is a really interesting role to have had, given that water insecurity can destabilize nations and affect US national security interests, which is partly why I assume, perhaps incorrectly, that the position was created. So curious to hear your take, from that view at the State Department. What spaces and measures exist for cooperation to mitigate water crises?
Yeah, and maybe just to follow on Scott for a quick second, one of the arguments I used to make is, if you can give me control of the WTO, I could solve the world's water problems. And so I really appreciate, Scott, you making that linkage between economics. The other thing I might just, and this gets to, I think, maybe a segue to answering your question. I think we're stuck in viewing water as a problem to be solved versus a job to be done. And I just want to remind folks that, we have these SDGs, we have these targets, and everybody's fixated on, oh, if we just do this, we'll be done. We will never be done with water. Water is an everyday task, and every single day, forever and ever, we're going to have to work to provide services so that people have the water they need, where they need it, when they need it, to do the things that they need to be able to do. And it's an everyday thing. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges around water, is that it's not like a vaccine. It's not like something where we're going to be able to put in a fix and we're going to be done. The fact is, we need institutions and things that will support a way of working that will go forever and ever. And I think that gets to your question, which I would almost turn around a little bit, because rather than thinking about, there's no question that water is going to be a factor in state fragility and failure, and it may be a factor in interstate conflict. But to be frank, the linkages between water insecurity and conflict are very weak at best. Right? It's not going to be a proximal cause in almost any case. And so water wars is a great meme, but it really doesn't play out well in reality. And so I think, from a foreign policy perspective, can we flip this around? In other words, how can we use cooperation over water as a means for strengthening regional integration, for strengthening cooperation, strengthening security? In other words, how do we use it as a diplomatic tool to protect and advance U.S. national security interests, rather than us thinking that we need to prevent a conflict or go in and solve some of the type of thing? And I think when you think of it that way, it kind of changes then our approach to how we might deal with these water issues. The first is, we're going to need to be able to, at the end of the day, to balance supply with demand, we're going to need to reconcile water use at the basin level, which often crosses political boundaries and political borders. And so how do we build then the capacity of countries and communities to work together cooperatively to solve what is a very complicated technical, financial, social, political problem? That process in and of itself is building skills within communities and countries that lead to a safer, more secure world. And so I fundamentally believe that water can be a great tool for advancing democracy, for advancing security, and advancing all of our strategic interests without necessarily thinking that, we have to do this to solve a conflict over water, because that's just not necessarily true in many places throughout the world.
And I have two follow-up questions for either of you, actually. And so one is, and I remember when Scott spoke to us years ago, that this was the big takeaway for me, is that it's actually a lot less about conflict and a lot more about cooperation. And so I'm curious to understand why, in your perspective, from your vantage point, why water is not this source of conflict that everyone thinks it is. Because if it's so essential, one would think that the scarcity would lead to conflict, and yet that seems to not be the case. And I remember Scott saying that, and so I'd love to understand why that is. Aaron, if you want to take a stab, or Scott, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of myths that govern water, right? Because there's a lot of intuitive things about water that we think must be true, and that competition over a scarce resource must necessarily lead to conflict. But the fact is, when water doesn't become available, people need it, and they start looking for other sources, and they start trying to find ways to meet that. It's also, to be frank, it's very difficult during drought periods to sustain military operations. And so in many respects, being in a water poor situation undermines your ability to execute in military actions. The other is that people are prone to cooperate more times than they are. Now, Aaron Wolf and I have had this discussion for decades about people cooperate more over water than they go into conflict. The reality is people cooperate more over everything than go to conflict. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. And all of our relationships, even with our significant others and partners, are governed by us cooperating more often than conflicting. And the fact is, luckily, that's where we are as a civilization and a people. We need to find cooperative solutions, and we recognize that. That is our superpower as human beings that differentiates us from animals, and the rest of the animal kingdom, right? It's our ability to work collectively together to solve really complicated and hard problems. And so that's our superpower. And I think that superpower means that on water generally, as we approach some of these challenges, we're going to try to find cooperative solutions.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to save my second follow-up question for later, and turn to you, Scott. About a conflicting relationship in international affairs, and one that I think you know a lot about. So in a discussion with the China file, you spoke about how the effective approach to China-US climate diplomacy will have to be based more on competition than cooperation. And so what does that look like presently in the wake of just the tensions between China and the US? And particularly, and one of the good news stories I think we heard last week is the restart of climate talks between the two countries. And so what role do you think water will play, and how does the dynamic between China and the US shape water issues?
Well, yeah, thanks, Courtney. And yeah, I just came back from COP27 climate talks in Egypt, which continue, of course, this week. But maybe I just sort of say two quick things before getting to your question. In terms of linking the two, in terms of water security and climate change in particular. Aaron did draw that link in his opening remarks, but just sort of underscore it a little bit. First of all, I think one thing that has taken place over the last few years is an increasing effort by policymakers and to some degree civil society as well to draw more of a connection between climate change and water security agendas, which it's maybe worth saying don't 100% overlap. There are kind of water issues like water supply and sanitation that have a climate dimension, but also operate somewhat independently of global climate change. On the other hand, most aspects of particularly what we would talk about in terms of the world's water crisis or threats to water security certainly are heavily impacted by climate change, again, as Aaron mentioned. So you see that kind of linkage increasingly being drawn. One just sort of little tagline that I think is useful in thinking about it is that energy is the crux of mitigating climate change or reducing emissions, but water really is the crux of adaptation or finding ways to be more resilient or hopefully to deal with the impacts of climate change. And the two that are kind of leap out are increased flooding on the one hand and water scarcity on the other. So just to say that those sort of are roughly how the linkages play out, both in substance and in terms of what we see in kind of the policy arena. But just to quickly get to your specific question, this particular set of climate talks focuses more intently than previous ones have on adaptation, and in particular agriculture, food security, and water security to some degree. The other big difference in previous years is that this is the first one where that started without the United States and China having any formal contact over climate change. Climate cooperation had been suspended, by Beijing in August in response to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which for China was, sort of a huge affront. I think the impact of that was somewhat limited, actually, in terms of direct effect on the course of the climate talks, in part because this focus on adaptation, including aspects of water security, is frankly even more complicated. And this gets to some of the themes we've already talked about than mitigation per se, because dealing with the world's water crisis is an even more difficult political, economic, and sort of institutional challenge than is transforming the world's energy system. It's even more complex, if you can believe that. And so while I think the sort of temporary demise, and it, as of yesterday, has apparently resumed, but the temporary demise of U.S.-China climate cooperation impeded these talks a little bit, but not as much as they otherwise would have, simply because these issues, including water, are so difficult, if you can believe that.
Thank you. So given the complexity of this issue, Aaron, how serious do you think the international community is about, I don't want to say solving, because solving seems almost too simplistic, but either mitigating crises or putting into place some of these governance or economic measures that you've mentioned? where would you put the international community, whatever that really is, in terms of solving these issues right now, or addressing them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? Because you can go by words or you can go by actions. And I've always been a big fan of, if you really want to know what a government's doing, look at the budget and where are the budgetary allocations going, and are they providing the right resources that enable their own ministries, their own partners to be able to deliver the services that the people need. And I think that's where we're clearly falling short. I mean, the World Bank did a recent study where they looked at public expenditures and public accounts for water supply and sanitation. And what they found was that many governments were not even spending the resources, many ministries were not even spending the resources that they've been allocated for these types of services. And that suggests some real different kind of bottlenecks than what we normally think about in terms of impediments to providing these services. And so I think a large part of this is that we still have governments that are not responsible to meeting the basic needs of their people. They're not prioritizing these issues in the way that they need to. We're not building up the workforce and the skills that we need to be able to provide the services. But there's still some just fundamental marketing problems. It won't be too long before we're knee deep in wastewater. And we don't, how do you fund that? How do you finance that? Who pays for that? And even things as simple as on-site sanitation systems that proliferate peri-urban environments in poor and marginalized communities. How do you empty those systems? How do you properly treat that waste? Who pays for that? And how do you make that financially remunerative? What are the right technologies? There's a lot of really tough questions that need to be there. I think the global community, let's maybe some credit where credit is due. Next year in 2023, the UN is going to host the first high-level meeting we've had on water in over 50 years. So, leaders from across the world will be meeting to talk about these issues. But the outcome of that meeting will not be a negotiated outcome. It will not be an agreed upon framework. It'll be a collection of what they hope will be game-changing ideas and partnerships that the world will work to implement and make happen. I think that falls short, right? I mean, we make this, unlike, I think, the energy sector, and I think Scott made this point pretty clearly, right? When you can take action at a global level around certain sets of issues, but the management of water is really down at the local level, where all of us live in a community, and within that community, we have people who are providing those services and providing those skill sets that need to be funded, financed. They need jobs and all of that. The work of water is really happening down at the local level. And it's really tough to see how some of these UN discussions or these macro types of things are really going to enable action down at the ground level that we really need to see. And so I think they're just fundamental reforms that really need to have. I think governments really need to step up, and I don't think we're seeing it, at least not yet.
That's 50 years. That's really startling, actually.
Right.
Right.
I mean, because you'd think, and we talked about this at CSD, that we'd want to have these conversations on a more regular basis. But even then, the people that we collect within the UN are not really representative of the water community.
Okay.
These are not the real practitioners. They're not the plumbers, right? They're not the irrigators. They're not the people who are using and building and in the business of water every day. And so we're really having these conversations absent the right kind of people.
So it sounds like there almost needs to be some sort of connector between this, transnational level and then what's really happening at the local level.
Right.
Yeah. That's your next job, figuring that out.
Part of what we're doing here, but yeah, it's exactly right. I'd love to hear Scott's view though on the COP, because I've been very cynical of how water's been integrated into the climate agenda. And I think, he's articulated a pathway, but I feel that as a water community, we're kind of always left out, and we're at the kids' table. We have our separate pavilion, but we're not really part of the substance of the conversations. But I think these new discussions on loss and damages really, it starts to raise, right? Because water is the key vehicle in which a lot of these things are going to happen. It starts to bring more attention to that. But I don't know how that's not going to play out.
Okay, well, since you asked, Aaron,
I think you're muted. Yeah, there we go.
I do think it's fascinating. At a high level, it is absolutely fair to say that the COP agenda, meaning the kind of formal United Nations climate change negotiation process, has really prioritized mitigation And it's done so particularly at the behest of the major powers, essentially, including the United States, which has always really pushed mitigation over adaptation. And there are some, not so noble reasons why that's the case. But there is also one big understandable, which is the more and faster that we mitigate, the less adaptation, at least in principle, we'll have to do. Unfortunately, it has become very clear that no matter what we do from this point on, we're going to be dealing with some very extreme climate effects, and we already are. And one thing that has struck me about sort of just how the global conversation has evolved, and I mean, this has been the case for a while, but I think discernibly, even over the past year, is that we historically, I think, have thought about water related issues or crises primarily as region specific ones. We got a really bad drought out west, the Middle East, water scarce region. It's a sort of, we tend to bound it territorially or geographically. And what's begun to happen now is because of the sheer number of extreme weather events, especially floods and extreme droughts around the world, it has almost become useless to think of these water-related crises as geographically bounded. There are so many of them, and they're occurring all over the world, that it's sort of become a global problem. And I think people have started to think of it more in global terms than in sort of these regionally or locally bounded ones. The problem, of course, as Aaron underscored it, and I reflected on as well, is that the governance is still very much local, regional, national. There's almost no global governance of water specifically, and that does get to, I think, Aaron, your point, which I think does sadly remain true, that kind of water as an issue does remain a kind of poor relation in the global climate agenda as it stands. I do think, as we have seen, and it really started with this COP, I would argue, a discernible focus on adaptation over mitigation. As you see that focus continue, I do think there will be more opportunity to put water front and center, but it's going to require addressing, among other things, something that, again, Aaron, you brought up that I just underscore, which is that water, frankly, is a little bit of a weird field. There aren't nearly as many people working on it as other aspects of, climate. Again, easiest contrasting example is energy. We don't have the kind of human capital and intellectual resources to bring to bear on water issues that exist in these other sectoral areas. And I think that is a real problem, and is at least part of the reason why this sort of poor relation dynamic does continue to play out.
Well, and Scott, and you pointed to, I think, some of the political intractability of leaders to respond to this issue, which I also completely agree with. A good example, I think, even in the US, we had the president who just launched the White House Action Plan on water, yet water doesn't really appear in the national security strategy. Food security does, climate security does. Water is really such an important component to those things. Why doesn't it have its own paragraph in the national security strategy, which would then open up opportunities for the agencies and the rest of the broader US government to engage in a different way? And so, again, I think we all talk about it and we all say it's important, but for some reason, getting that political commitment in there is just really tough to do.
Is that, and that's also fascinating, is that because of the jurisdictional issues? Is it a political issue where they don't want to put it in there because then it raises issues?
I think Scott alluded to it, which is, there's something I call the water headache, right? That this issue is so complicated that the more you peel away the layers and the more you think about it, the more your head starts to hurt. And ultimately you say, you know what, I'm going to do something that's easier. And that's particularly true for political leaders that have 4-year time horizons. They want to come in, they want something that's actionable, they want something that they can actually say they've done and accomplished. Getting an agreement on mitigation is, my view, right? It's easier to represent, it's easier to envision, easier to target than trying to change all the fundamental things that have to be reformed to deliver water services sustainably. And so it's just tough.
Yeah, I mean, my head's beginning to hurt over this right now. I hope to try to get in just a couple more quick questions before I turn to the Q&A box, and I'll start to weave those questions in. One thing that struck me is I know the world just passed its 8 billionth person, I think, recently, and particularly when contrasting water versus energy, and there's so much emphasis on renewable resources with energy and ways of mitigating that issue with water. And I'm way outside my lane here, but it seems like we're dealing with a very different situation, and so the each additional person, it's more strain on all of the resources. Scott, where I'm getting to is the role of technology. I know it often opens windows as an escape. It can also create new problems in the process. So I'm curious, what role is technology playing in the water crisis? How do you see more advent, and do you see the advent of more widespread use of technologies and techniques like cloud seeding or desalination changing the conversation, to what Aaron mentioned before in terms of sanitation? Are people working on technologies to address those issues? Because it really seems like it's a mismatch of resources and location. And so can technology play a role at all?
Absolutely. And here's maybe the right time to introduce kind of the sort of breakdown in how the world's water is actually used and sort of functions. So globally, agriculture is about 70% of total water use. And that is important because basically technology only really plays a helpful role in the other 30% of global water use for what's called sort of urban or residential use, including drinking water, and for industry. Up till now, to the extent that technology has played a role in that agricultural water use, that huge 2/3 of global water use, it's been mainly to increase the ability of farmers to use water from more deeper, harder to reach places. So it hasn't really done much to solve the kind of global problem. There are some technologies that that under certain circumstances can be helpful. So things like drip irrigation, the use of satellite-based remote sensing to be able to really accurately track how much water is being used by farms. And that actually links to one thing Aaron brought up, which is challenges with data collection and measurement. It's only pretty recently in the last 10 years that we've been able to reliably understand how much water is being pulled out of subsurface aquifers, for example, because prior to about 10 years ago, the only way we knew how much water people were using from groundwater over large areas was to just collect individual well measurements. And you can imagine all the challenges involved in that. But at a large level, we haven't had great deployment of technology to solve that agricultural piece of the puzzle, which is by far the biggest. Where technology has played more of a role and will continue to do so going forward is more on that urban, residential, and industrial water use side. And we can maybe I saw a few folks had been curious about desalination, but just to say that technology continues to get better and better, but not good enough that it's ever going to be practical for agricultural uses, for example. It's getting cheaper, getting more efficient, but it's only going to be for those industrial and urban residential applications. And so technology, for the most part, has only solved problems in that third of global water use. And we need a lot more thinking and investment in the application of novel technologies in the agricultural side of things.
Yes, I would just add to that. I think Scott's exactly right. One, there is no silver bullet, right? Again, there's no vaccine. There's nothing that we're going to be able to develop that's going to get us out of this. Number two, I do think, especially around irrigation, there are very simple technologies. Even bringing fields under irrigation would do a lot to reduce water consumption. Laser land leveling, very simple technologies, nothing that hasn't, things that have existed for years and years and years. can be brought into bear that can reduce on-farm water consumption. And so even adopting those modest practices, I think, can go a long way. Probably the biggest thing that we're going to need to do, though, going forward is how do we reconcile where the water is with where we use water? And this gets back to Scott's previous point around trade, right? We've got a lot of countries that are using water to grow crops that they just shouldn't be growing there. Let's be frank about it. And they've got, unfortunately, economies and communities that are built around that economic base and that infrastructure. And that's a real challenge. How we begin to get some of these countries to think long-term about over the next 30 to 50 years, how are they going to move away from being an agrarian-driven economy? How are they going to access their water through the open market by importing beef, importing other food products, and do a better job managing their own water resources that they've got in their limited country? I mean, this is a really interesting conversation about haves and have-nots. It's playing out right now in COP about, what do we do with countries that were not, for lack of a better term, blessed with the natural resources to succeed? And does the rest of the world have an obligation to provide those resources?
There have been some points, Aaron, that have come up in your questions, and I'm turning now to the Q&A box along with my final question, because there's a similar question in the Q&A box. You've kept touching upon the role of markets and financing and the economics of water, which is something that we haven't delved into in great detail in this conversation, and yet it seems like a piece that is worth talking about. And so we have a question in the Q&A box that asks, why is there no global market for water, as so many countries are lacking it? And I'd like to add on to that, what are some of the economic solutions that you would like to see? And, are there companies or sectors that are stepping up in a way to address this economic piece? Because it seems like it's a critical part.
All yours, Scott.
Okay, here we go. Lots of reasons. I think probably well, I don't know if it's the single biggest, but the first one to consider is sheer historical inertia. Every human community that's ever lived has depended on access to fresh water. And not every human community that's ever lived has depended on access to energy minerals. And so it's historically around most of the world just been treated as a kind of a common resource that over time, laws, regulations, and things like that have been built up to sort of govern it, communal practices, but markets have way lagged. It's also much more kind of resistant to marketization than other resources. If you just think about how hard it is to know exactly how much water, I talked about the difficulties in measuring groundwater extraction, for example. It's really hard to kind of even track how much water individual users are using. Water is constantly cycling, surface, subsurface, atmospheric. It's really tough to just sort of monitor and track. There's also a huge political component, which is just that, and Aaron, I think, alluded to this earlier, because water is so critical to every part of the economy, every sort of facet of human existence, really, there aren't many constituencies you don't offend when you want to try to raise the price of water or regulate the access to water. And to the extent that you do, you probably are creating winners and losers. And again, because water is universally necessary, those winner and loser groups are going to be pretty large. And so I think it's to be avoided from a political perspective whenever possible. So for all of those reasons, you just get a lot of, and others too, you just get real difficulties with kind of commoditizing or deploying market mechanisms for water. That being said, I think it's a critical part of the solution. Lots of companies, have tried to squeeze value out of water. Very few have succeeded, other than in urban water supply. Drinking water and certain industrial parts of the equation are really where you see value. But let me just sort of end with saying, forget profits. There are real Nobel Prizes to be won by just figuring out how you can better leverage this sort of economic piece of the puzzle when it comes to, again, particularly water use in agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, I do think market solutions can provide the solution for in small areas and small regions. I mean, market-based approaches to managing the allocation of water across basins, across different farmers, I think has a lot of potential to help incentivize better water use without having to tackle some of the more politically challenging problems of changing the underlying water rights and things like that. And so I think there are opportunities for that. I agree, though, that water is just extremely ugly in terms of what's the cost of production, and how that cost of production changes in real time, and how even the consumer, the value of that water to the consumer changes in real time in very dynamic ways. And reconciling all that in a global market scheme would be very, very difficult. And I agree, there are winners and losers, and water is one of those issues that one might argue could be a human right, but it's something we have to be careful of.
Absolutely, thank you. We have some really great questions in the Q&A box, so I'll put them out there. I'll start with you, Aaron. How can the infrastructure gap be mitigated, and how can the water gap between developed and developing nations be reduced? Does the United States have a responsibility?
Well, it depends what you mean by water gap, right? There are many water-rich countries that still can't provide basic services to their people. And there are many water scarce countries that do an exceptional job of providing services to their people. And so it isn't about everybody or every country having access to the same amount of water, right? That's probably something that doesn't make sense. And in fact, even if you were to conceptualize what a human right to water would be, you'd like to look at things like equal access under equal circumstances. And that doesn't mean the same amount for everybody. It just means that everybody in similar conditions has the same levels of access, and it's a little bit different. Infrastructure is going to be a key part of this. Should the United States be investing in infrastructure overseas for managing water? Yes, but so should those own governments, right? Again, we've got public monies that are sitting within governments, within ministries that are not being spent on building the infrastructure that needs to be built to manage water. Most water infrastructure is not sexy. Some large dams you can name and you can brand and you can do it, but it'll take you 15 years to build it. And if you're not a president for 15 years, you don't get credit for the program you started. And so these types of investments there are extraordinarily long term planning horizons, very long-term payment and investment scenarios that go along with these pieces of infrastructure. And all that needs to be put in place, and it's very, very complicated. I do think the United States may play a better role in guaranteeing investments around water. I don't think we should be the primary investor, but I do think by providing guarantees that we can leverage funding from other sources and even local capital to invest in water infrastructure. And I think that's one of the things USAID has been doing a little bit more of, which is great work, and it should be expanded.
Fantastic, thank you. Scott, turning to you, which countries specifically do you think face the greatest water challenges regarding access or availability? And are any pursuing new approaches toward rectifying those problems?
So it's countries that face a combination.
Oh, I think you might be muted.
Mm-hmm.
No,
I can hear you.
I couldn't hear him. Oh, okay.
Okay. Hopefully, although that is always, no matter how long we've been used to the Zoom world, always happens. So it's the countries that are subject to a combination, excuse me, of ecological, climatic, political, and economic challenges. And so, just to sort of build that out a little bit, you have sort of a Venn diagram, if you want to think of it that way, of countries that do have natural, just sort of water scarcity, but are also subject to real institutional weakness, often are experiencing conflict, or recently been in the midst of conflict, and have very little in the way of economic or technical resources to deal with them. The region that kind of most closely, I think, sits in that Venn diagram is basically parts of the Arabian Peninsula and over into the Horn of Africa. Those are kind of a set of countries that are affected across all three of those dimensions. And I think if I had to pick one country that is most at risk for water insecurity. It's Yemen, a country that's been racked by conflict for decades now, really, but certainly very intensely over the past 12 years, is naturally water scarce and significantly, unlike most of its neighbors in the Gulf countries, does not have oil to speak of, or oil production, I should say, to speak of, and therefore doesn't have the financial or economic resources to deploy technologies like desalination at any scale that might help to alleviate very serious water-related issues. Should also maybe quickly add, Yemen's sort of has this fascinating geographic quirk where the capital and largest city, Sana'a, sits at a very high elevation. And so even if you wanted to do desalination or something like that, it's just hard to see as a technical financial matter, how you would be able to pump water. And so that's a country where you may actually see over time significant, in fact, you may already, Yemen's not the easiest to gather information on, but significant migration just due to actual physical water scarcity. You don't actually see that very often.
I'd probably add Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to that list.
I want to pick up on your last point, Scott, about migration, because we do have a question where someone writes, water-driven migration seems to be inevitable and necessary due to the cost and uncertainty of transporting water globally. How would you propose to manage this as the climate emergency unfolds? So could we dig into that a little bit more? I'm not sure who wants to take that, Aaron, if you want to, or, and then Scott, if you want to chime in.
This is still an area where there's a lot of work going on, right? Better understanding the role of water and climate change in incentivizing migration to other areas. Look, at the end of the day, you need to provide areas where people can live and productively feed their families and develop the way that they want to. And water is a key part of that. But it doesn't have to be all of that. And again, if we have to move people away from agrarian livelihoods into other types of livelihoods, or help them better adapt to rapidly changing conditions, around Lake Chad, where one year you may be a fisherman, the next year you're going to be a farmer, and you'd be able to adapt readily between those different economic livelihood styles, depending on what's happening in a given year. These are all the kinds of things that we're going to have to work to build that capacity and resilience in these communities. But again, data can help some of that, understanding the conditions in which people are living, being able to provide information that allow them to be more productive where they are all going to be part of those things. I think everybody moving to water-rich regions, that's probably not going to be sustainable either. And thinking that water is the only factor there, again, water is often not the proximal cause. It's the way governments are responding to the water challenge that's often the proximal cause of why people are leaving, why we have conflict, why we have other things going on.
If I could just quickly add to that, and I absolutely agree with everything Aaron said, but I think it does raise a fascinating, or get to a fascinating question, which is whether we are seeing in some kind of key parts of the world, essentially water-related ecological limits to future growth and development. I noted one of the things I did while at COP was read China's most recent adaptation strategy. As I joke to people, I did it so that others don't have to. It's pretty dense. But one of the interesting things that comes out there, and this isn't unprecedented in the case of China, but is actually the mention that particular regions, especially the capital Beijing, future development will be planned in part with a view toward water resource constraints, or taking into account water resource constraints. This is also something that I think we're being pressed to begin to think about in the U.S. Southwest, where I think at a minimum, you can say that you can't have all of the agriculture that's there, all of the urban development that's there, and all of the environmental laws that we currently have. It's just not possible to satisfy all of those objectives. And something I think, we'll have to get. That being said, it's also important to recognize, as Aaron pointed out, that water is not usually the main constraint on, growth or sort of people movements. And there are a lot of ways to arbitrage, essentially, regional water scarcity. So both of those things are true, but I think one question on the horizon is for certain regions of the world, whether there are effectively water-related constraints on future growth.
Thank you. And you have a nice segue into a whole group of questions where we have a bunch in the Q&A about looking domestically and at North America in particular. So what I'm going to do is I'll try to combine as many as I can, and then maybe Aaron, start with you, and then Scott, see if you want to add on to that. So we have, is the Canadian American Joint International Commission regarding shared water a good example for countries looking for precedents for international cooperation of shared water boundaries? I'm going to throw a few out there. So just bear with me. Could either of both or both of you address the prospect of bulk water exports from Canada to the US under terms of the USMCA to alleviate prolonged drought conditions in California and the Southwest? Should we expect a diplomatic conflict over this adaptive measure and perhaps first large-scale example of global water marketing? What are the water transborder issues facing the US and how are they being and should be addressed? And I'm trying to, I thought that there was a fourth one on that, but those might be all, but that's certainly, oh yes, and could you address the domestic water situation as well as implications with Canada? So a lot of interest in US, Canada, and North America. So take it, cornucopia, take what you will.
I'll try to do them as quickly as I can. Bulk water transfers, good luck. I don't think you'll be seeing too many of those in the future, and I don't think that's politically tenable. In terms of good examples for regional cooperation, I prefer the IBWC over the IJC. The IJC is a very unique institution that can provide recommendations to the government, but the IBWC is a little bit different in its organizational structure and the way governments are involved and the way decision-making is made. And I am hard-pressed to find a better example globally of a body that's adapted to, the treaty that we have with Mexico is well over 100 years old, and the fact is we've, unlike many other treaties, we haven't taken it as a fixed agreement. We've allowed that agreement to evolve and adapt as we've better understood the conditions and needs of the two countries, and maintain a productive relationship with Mexico over water. And that's been a very challenging relationship to continue to make sure we do well. And so I would turn to the IBWC as a good example of how you might be able to do that, and how where there's a significant power imbalance, right? United States and Canada is a little bit different than the United States and Mexico. And I think in many basins, when we look globally, we're going to see these imbalances. And again, I think the IBWC is a different kind of a model that actually can serve us well in looking at those other types of issues. So sorry, maybe I'll stop there to see if Scott wants to weigh in, then we can go back and forth on some of the other elements there.
Yeah, well, interesting. Yeah, an interesting interest in our own kind of national neighborhood here, which I do think is great, and just underscore two things that Aaron said. I think first of all, North America is a pretty good example, certainly not perfect, but of international cooperation over water, and I think mostly bears out that point we talked a little bit about at the beginning, that water is more often a catalyst for international cooperation than it is international conflict. The other thing just to say is that, yeah, this question of long distance, bulk water transfers often comes up. It normally doesn't succeed for a combination of economic, political, and technical reasons. And one thing that I always think is helpful to keep in mind about water goes to some of the other things we've talked about, is that water is exceptionally heavy and therefore expensive and energy intensive to transport per unit volume. And that does affect a lot of the kind of potential solutions and certainly the economics of transferring water across long distances.
Thanks. And is there anything else you want to add on North America, Aaron, or?
Well, we're certainly facing our own large set of domestic challenges. And to be frank, I mean, the United States is not a very good example of the political leadership necessary to solve these problems as well. I mean, I was part of the drought task force set up by President Obama when we had some of the major droughts in California a decade or so ago. And when we're all sitting up in the White House, and the White House says, okay, so what do we need to do? And there were about 10 of us from each of the major agencies. And we all said the exact same thing, right? Which is we need to reconsider the system of water rights. That's the only way we're really going to get down to the fundamentals of how these issues are driving the conditions that we're seeing out in the American West. And the response was, great, next, because it's just politically not tenable. And we're not going to be able to overcome those issues with our local parliamentarians and in Congress. It's just not going to happen. And so, unfortunately, we still just we haven't been pushed to the point where we're going to make the political reforms that are going to be necessary to really tackle these issues, even here in the US.
Thank you. We have another group of questions around desalinization. And I'll throw a bunch of them out and you can take what you pick. I'll start with, or take what you wish. Scott, I'll start with you and then go to Aaron. Can you just please describe the role of water desalinization companies and desalinization stocks? What is their role in the supply? What further international cooperation can be achieved in desalinization projects? And I think that there was one more. And this might go to what you were saying earlier, Scott, about the cost of transporting water, but could massive desalinization projects combined with massive water transportation schemes from the coast to the interior be organized to offset the global rise of oceans caused by climate change and solve water scarcity in many countries? So Scott.
Okay, I think point one, if you have enough cheap energy, you can do just about anything, including desalinate huge volumes of seawater and transport it places. And there are a few countries that are able to do that, most notably Saudi Arabia. But even there, the kind of economics and just practicality do not favor the use of desalinated water for that 70% of water use, which again is agriculture. And you see that around the world. The only place I know of where desalinated water is used for agriculture is in Israel. That's a very specific circumstance that depends in part on having very high retail water prices. And, we've talked a little bit about pricing here and there, but it's worth emphasizing that, particularly when you kind of get around to how much technology, how much infrastructure are you deploying to address regional differences in water supply and availability, depends on your water pricing structure. And around the world, you have seen a slow upward pressure on water resources, in part because the needs of capital investment for drinking water supply keep going up. That's really a global phenomenon, will continue to do so. But again, you don't have even really national water markets in most cases, let alone global markets. So it's really tough for the economics to kind of drive efficient allocations. And getting back to one of the points that was made earlier. That being said, desalination does continue to get more efficient. One thing that's always helpful to note is nothing approaches the efficiency of a cell membrane for desalination, and we have seen some progress recently toward biomimetic substances that might allow us to get closer to that level of efficiency, and that would really help. But probably isn't going to change again the sort of fundamental economics or frankly physics of the whole thing. The last point I would make, though, is I think what you're seeing is a trend around the world where most big coastal cities, which keep in mind that is also most cities around the world, most big cities around the world are investing in some significant desalination capacity as effectively an adaptation strategy against water scarcity. And I think you'll see that continue. So most large coastal cities around the world will have desalination. They'll try to rely on rainfall and other forms of precipitation and groundwater, but if need be, they'll turn to that desal capacity. So you're going to see continued investment around the world.
Which I think they need to do because of the salinization of their own supplies as sea level rises along those coastal areas.
Absolutely, that's a piece of it too. Absolutely.
Great. Well, I feel like we're just at about time. This was fascinating. I think the number one thing I'm coming away with is just how incredibly complex this issue is. So thank you both for working on it, and I hope that people that see this webinar share it and more people get into this space, because it seems like it's one that's ripe for more smart minds coming into and tackling what seems to be an incredibly complex problem. So thank you both for taking the time. Just a few notes before we leave. Our next upcoming briefing, it's for members only. You can also find out about joining as a member, but we're looking at a post-Abe Japan and a changing Asia. And so that's Monday at 6 p.m. So please do, if you scan to RSVP, you'll find out information about joining as a member. And then we also have Putin's Vision for the Russian World Disorder. And that is coming up on December 1st. So 2 excellent briefings. Please do join us if you can. And, just one final plea as we enter the holiday season. We are a nonprofit. We rely on donations, more than like 2/3 come from individuals. So I encourage you to donate and donate generously so that we can keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Aaron. This was fascinating. And thank you for the work you do. It was really a great conversation.
Thanks, Courtney. Take care. Good to see you,
Bye-bye.
Scott.
Great to see you, Aaron. Thank you, Courtney.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.